What if our sense of self and reality are just fragments of a much larger puzzle? I'm thinking of a bridge connecting the intricate workings of our brains to the fabric of the universe. Today, we'll uncover two fascinating perspectives that challenge the boundaries of what we know. First, a groundbreaking study on the brain's anterior precuneus, also known as the APCU, and its role in shaping our bodily sense of self. And second, Andrew Gallimore's alien information theory, which proposes that consciousness is a part of a hyperdimensional code, with dimethyltryptamine, also known as DMT, acting as a technology to interface with intelligences beyond our own. Both the APCU and DMT influence our awareness of self and the world around us, offering profound insights into dissociation, selfhood, and the deeper layers of existence. My name is Matthew Sabatine, and welcome to the Common Caveat podcast, where I help you navigate the crossroads of the Christian faith, science, and the human experience. First, I need to discuss the mundane stuff before getting into the crazy and controversial stuff. The mundane stuff is found in a 2023 open access report titled Causal Evidence for the Processing of Bodily Self in the Anterior Precuneus. In discussing the foundational mechanisms of consciousness, the report mentions that the cortical areas on the outer layer of the brain and the subcortical areas deeper within the brain must work together to realize our sense of physical location in space, the ownership of our body, our perspective of the world, and the feeling of control over our actions. 10 specific areas must work together to unite the whole bodily experience and achieve the mobility and awareness we normally take for granted. Number 1 is the premotor cortex, which plans and coordinates voluntary movements. Number 2 is the somatosensory cortex, which processes sensory input such as touch, temperature, body position, and movement. Number 3 is the extrastriate area, which recognizes and processes visual images of human bodies and their parts. Number 4 is the insula, which is responsible for the sense of internal states such as hunger or heart rate, emotional awareness, and uniting sensory input with feelings of selfhood. Number 5 is the intraparietal sulcus, which is responsible for the spatial attention and visual motor coordination that realize your self-location and body schema. Number 6 is the temporoparietal junction, also known as the TPJ, which helps you distinguish yourself from others and to assume and hold a perspective. Number 7 is the mid-cingulate cortex, which is responsible for the attention and motivation in processing pain states. Number 8 is the posterior superior temporal gyrus, which is responsible for social perception and language processing for uniting sensory input in relationship to yourself and others. Number 9 is the precuneus, which is responsible for self-reflection, episodic memory, and spatial navigation. And finally, number 10 is the putamen, which is in charge of motor control, learning, and reward processing for movements and awareness. Now, disruption of those brain regions can be responsible for things such as out-of-body experiences, the feeling of falling or floating, the detachment or alienation from a body part, visual distortions, emotions, feeling out of touch with one's actions, the perceptions of body image, and more. Depersonalization is a very important term here. This can happen as a result of severe anxiety or panic attacks, trauma, or extreme stress. If you watch someone not levitating nor leaving their body when they genuinely feel they are, it is undeniable that they are experiencing an illusion or a hallucination, which by definition is opposite of the reality we would see with our sane and lucid eyes while standing next to them. And I think we try to transfer this same kind of sanity and lucidity to our waking, mundane judgments of the DMT trips people have described. We just simply say they are having illusory social events with characters of fictional madness. Later, I'll get into why hallucination hypotheses and mundane sanity are inadequate for explaining the DMT world. But for now, let's get back to the open access report. The report mentions that a considerable amount of neuroimaging studies have linked the posterior medial cortex, also known as the PMC, of the default mode network, also known as the DMN, to the representation of the narrative self. For one patient in particular, self-dissociation was the result of disruptive seizures and electrical input to the PMC region. Paralleling that was an optogenetic study which involves activating and deactivating cells by shining a light on their light-sensitive proteins, and in this case, it was done on the PMC region in rodents alongside the use of ketamine infused into their bloodstream with an IV. Researchers observed brainwave patterns oscillating in the PMC and behaviors linked to dissociation. The report details the study they performed, in which 9 people in total were recruited, while 8 of them had no pre-existing epilepsy-related issues in the regions that would be electrically perturbed. They had electrodes implanted in their PMC to observe its role in autobiographical memory and self-reference. Their results indicate that the APCU subregion within the PMC is crucial to the construction of personal awareness of one's physical and spatial self. The youngest participant was 19 years of age, and the oldest was 51. Anywhere from 100 to 200 electrodes were used per person. One 28-year-old male had 233 electrodes implanted in his seizure onset zone, in which he is documented as saying, quote, "My frontal lobe is getting dumber," end quote. Spatial awareness and walking balance were affected in another participant. During the self-dissociation, he is quoted as saying, "The system I know as myself leaves my body. I listen to 2 parts of my brain speak to each other in a way that a third part of my brain, which I consider to be me, is able to listen, like 2 independent computer components talking to each other, but my me was just the observer. The other parts of my brain that were talking, I stopped considering them me, exactly like if you were listening to a different person inside your head," end quote. Researchers quoted him further after stimulating the left and right APCU, quote, "Same dissociation as my seizures, closest to my seizure episodes. What you created with the stimulation was that separation, but not of my control over my body. The same way a pilot can lose control of a plane. They can be forced out of the cockpit, or forced to not control it, but still see what is happening to the whole plane. That is what just happened. I got pulled out of the cockpit, or I got pulled out of the chair, the pilot's chair, but I could still see all the gauges. What you did was move me out of that chair a little bit," end quote. Researchers asked the participant if he was floating in space, and his response was, quote, "No, I was floating more in myself," end quote. The researchers used placebo placebos or sham stimulation as the control condition. They investigated how participants' responses were influenced by the strength and repetition of electrical perturbations applied to their hot zones. A total of 25 electrode pairs were stimulated multiple times. Participants reported varying subjective experiences, including sensations of falling, floating, dizziness, lack of focus, or self-dissociation. Overall, there was a 92% consistency in the occurrences of these responses across participants. Author Bruce Goldman published a neuroscience.com article in which he quotes Joseph Parvizi, a standard medicine physician scientist involved with the study. Parvizi is quite acquainted with the practice of passing currents through electrodes to perturb discrete brain matter and observing the results. One of his patients is quoted as saying, "Every time I have a seizure, I have a sense of depersonalization and dissociation. Everything's unreal, not happening to me." Upon working with other 8 participants, Parvizi is quoted as saying, "All of them reported something weird happening to their sense of physical self. In fact, 3 of them reported a clear sense of depersonalization, similar to taking psychedelics," end quote. Now, this is where things get fun, ladies and gentlemen, because comparing depersonalization with psychedelics warrants further investigation. So let's have a look at the work of someone who focuses his studies on psychedelics. His name is Dr. Andrew Gallimore, and he is a computational neurobiologist and chemical pharmacologist by training, with a history of working in academic settings and publishing peer-reviewed studies, and in recent years has ventured into freelance writing and public engagements. Depersonalization can be partially related to, but not precisely mapped as an invariable symptom onto psychedelic experience, which I'm basing on my estimation on the accounts of those who've tried psychedelics such as DMT. For instance, let's use Gallimore's personal account of trying DMT for himself and his reference to Terence McKenna's concept of death by astonishment that is characterized as a face-to-face contact with the, quote, indescribable, non-Euclidean, non-Newtonian, irrational, un-Englishable place of utter weirdness, end quote. McKenna's concept had not resonated with Gallimore until Gallimore tried DMT. He regards the experience as, quote, compelling and undeniably real, with its disorienting geometric forms, end quote, in a space that is completely inconceivable to the human imagination. And furthermore, according to Gallimore, our brains did not evolve to naturally comprehend and inhabit the DMT world, even though our brains, in fact, evolved throughout time to comprehend and inhabit this physical, mundane world, since we were not just dropped onto Earth like a sack of potatoes in the middle of nowhere. Thus, the brain must, quote, construct an entirely new model of reality to experience the DMT space, end quote. This is echoed by the Australian leading business strategist Kerwin Ray of the Unstoppable podcast, who interviewed Gallimore and briefly spoke of his DMT experience, which was ineffable for him, but he could at least describe the DMT dimension as more real than our everyday mundane reality. Furthermore, this is consistent with what other psychedelic trippers and near-death experiencers have described. It's more real than real. Gallimore's book, titled Alien Information Theory, borrows from Terence McKenna, saying, quote, we are imprisoned in some kind of work of art, end quote. And this is connected to the underlying code of reality that Andrew Gallimore discusses in his book. Code is a group of symbols and rules drafted to convey and represent information. The encoding information is pervasive among all intelligent creatures, including our closely related primates. But the natural languages of Homo sapiens have become the most advanced and malleable form of code expression, with mathematics and computer code making us quite distinguishable from the rest of nature. nature. Page 4 of Gallimore's book describes mathematics and computer code as humanity's transcendental transformation that led to, quote, a digital lycanthropy mounted on silicon and light. The transformation nears completion as we re-encode our world, our bodies, our minds into binary form and upload them to the central processing units of ever more sophisticated computer motherboards, end quote. Now, for a lot of you folks, that might be a mouthful, but stay with me. Gallimore goes on further to tell us that communication with extraterrestrials is not limited by interstellar travel, but instead enabled by the transmission of code. Everything in reality materializes from a fundamental code, like everything on your computer screen springs from strings of ones and zeros. A switch in that code will enable the transmission based on one of the 21 amino acids indispensable to the proteins from which all life is manufactured. Tryptophan is the amino acid that leads to the class of tryptamine molecules in which DMT belongs. The DMT derivatives abound among nearly all organisms. Only 2 enzymes are needed for synthesizing DMT from tryptophan. The chemical elegance and omnipresence of this mind-altering molecule is the gateway to the strange realities and intelligences veiled behind a 3-dimensional existence. We are stuck in this lower dimension that is detached from the orthogonal dimensions until we learn to manipulate the DMT technology for catapulting ourselves into the orthogonal ones. We are tied to a game, which Gallimore explains in greater detail beyond chapter 1, but he at least specifies the 6 levels of the game. Number 1 is information. Number 2 is emergence. Number 3 is transmission. Number 4 is immersion. Number 5 is realization. And number 6 is resolution. Cellular automaton is the type of computer program in which pure information self-organizes and self-complexifies. The world built by our brains is the subjective phenomenal world that is private only to us, but its information can be modulated and changed by psychedelics such as DMT and LSD to then also alter our phenomenal world to disagree with the mundanities of social consensus. Gallimore uses the term hyperspace as the freakish, transmundane place exceeding 3-dimensional space into which DMT launches us. Such a term is probably recognizable to science fiction enthusiasts as a way to describe what is essentially indescribable. So, as a Christian who does not recommend you use these drugs at home nor for fun, I'm reminded of Ephesians 6:12. Paralleling all of this. Quote, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." End quote. In later episodes, we'll discuss further Gallimore's book to figure out if he has evidence for DMT as a gateway to another realm of intelligences beyond our own. If there is such evidence, the manipulation of this molecule could arguably resemble occult practices that claim to summon spirits, and no amount of scientific jargon can reasonably invent a distinction between DMT contact with extraterrestrials and the summoning of spirits. We shouldn't assume that the hypothetical non-human entities of any otherworldly realm are benign and safe for contact. Given that DMT could be groundbreaking for legitimate technological and therapeutic use, any good instrument can still be misused, in spite of Gallimore's sincere work on eye-opening, enthralling science and metaphysics. This caveat on DMT must be said clearly, in spite of Gallimore's expressed desire to rely on the demonstrable natural sciences and not sacred magical text. Thank you for watching today's episode, ladies and gentlemen. Please hit the subscribe, knock that bell out of its place, and like this video. Thank you, and have a wonderful day or night wherever you are.